Thanks for having me here while the panel is just getting mic'd up now, so I'll go ahead and introduce the session a little bit. So I'm Jack Madden. I'm one of those millennials that they spent all the time talking about in the last session. So if you have any questions about millennial attitudes about work, IT, computing, I understand that millennial consultants can get some very successful billings, so come find me. So I write for a company called TechTarget. The site I write for is brianmadden.com. We've covered desktop virtualization for over 15 years now, and I came in to that site to be the enterprise mobility guy. They said, we're getting all these pitches about what to do about all these BYOD iPads, and this was around 2010 and 2011. So that was my job there at TechTarget, and the rest has been history since then. But today, I really want to have a pragmatic conversation about the challenges and advantages of mobility and the cloud and IoT as well. Now, you'll see this is actually a mobility-heavy panel, but we'll get to the cloud and IoT stuff. But I really want to have a good conversation about what is real and what isn't. Because for years, it's been almost 10 years now that we've been hearing about the huge amounts of Android malware, both inside and outside of the Google Play Store. But it's also been 10 years that we've had these modern mobile devices in our pockets, in most cases often without other security agents. And we still find that major breaches can be traced back to using unpatched traditional systems or compromised, weak, and stolen user credentials. And we see that the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report of 2016 really pointed out those unpatched systems and compromised credentials as a much more significant avenue of breaches than mobile devices. So on the one hand, we have all of the malware issues, and we know that these are endpoints that are sensitive, but on the other hand, there's no denying these modern mobile devices with their containerized operating systems that were born in the internet era to be always connected really do put us in a better place. So I want to have a nuanced discussion, and that we might get a little bit technical at times about the security challenges and advantages and as well as the role of EMM and OEMs and mobile threat defense. We have a couple of mobile threat defense folks on the panel. So let's get started. Let's bring up the panel. And as they're coming up, I'll get seated and we'll just do introductions one by one. I run a podcast at brianmadden.com, and we do a lot of arguing and sometimes jumping in, and so I told the panel here to go ahead and keep it conversational. If we get, we'll see where things going. So let's do some introductions. So Ricardo.
Hi, I'm Ricardo Panez. I'm the director for mobile security products at Checkpoint Software.
All right.
My name is Deepak. I'm the VP Enterprise Solutions at MPOYNT. We are a enterprise mobility solutions / managed service provider.
Hi, I'm Jim Walsh. I'm the VP of Sales for the SkyKeyer business, now called SEP Mobile within Symantec.
I'm Ankur Acharya. I'm offering manager for Mass 360, which is an IBM product for mobile security.
Okay, well, so thanks everybody for being here. As I mentioned, I'd like to start out the panel by really talking about the mobile security model, and it's interesting because we've had these devices, these modern iOS and Android devices, in our pockets for almost 10 years now, and so one, it's interesting that we're 10 years in, we're up here talking about mobile threat defense and mobile security, and it's just getting started. I think it helped to talk about the model. So and anyone can jump in. Let's define our mobile threat model. What's different with these devices than with our old devices?
When you say there's fundamental differences between traditional desktop operating system that's you could say argue 30, 40 years old practically from when it was its inception. It's evolved over time. If you look at mobile operating systems in general, they're relatively young, right? And obviously when you're building a new operating system, and what Android and what Google and Apple have done is they've thought about things and created a different operating system that has different functionalities, different limitations from a security perspective, but other than, which requires these bad actors to think differently and attack in a different way and look at different vectors, right? So we see things from, vectors that you would never think about that could be exploited on the desktop side are being exploited on the smartphone side, on the tablet side. You have the cellular connectivity, which also introduces another vector, right? So it's just a different landscape in terms of the threat vectors that can exist. And the biggest question is, what haven't we thought of yet? What are they thinking of and what they're developing, right? Because that keeps evolving. And as we see over the last even 18 to 24 months, a lot of new attacks have come to play and have risen up, that never thought were going to be possible, right?
Right. Well, first let's talk about, compared to a desktop operating system, what don't we have to worry about? Or maybe to put it a better way, what don't we have to worry about quite as much as we used to before?
I think with the whole initiative going towards application signing and sandboxing in mobile operating systems, I think there's a lot of scope that we put trust, and we can put trust in some of the applications and control them that run on our mobile devices. Sandboxing gives you that kind of a secure shell within the device to store your data and exchange it back and forth from your backend. So I think there are some areas that the mobile operating systems have a definite focus on security, and rightfully so, because they're everywhere, and mobile devices are expected to access every aspect of technology available out there, unlike the conventional computing devices.
And we can almost say by default, from the nature of the way that these devices came into our organizations, by BYOD, and they just sort of happened to us no matter what, by choice or just on an ad hoc basis, these devices almost became the most trusted devices that we have in our enterprise.
Sure.
If we compare the amount of attestation in some scenarios, if this thing walks in the door and we have to support it no matter what, well, maybe before that BYOD scenario happened, were there months of testing?
But ultimately, that's the biggest problem, right?
Exactly.
The biggest challenge is the fact that these devices were, consumer first, personal first, instead of necessarily business first. And, both Apple and Google, I think, are doing great strides in making them more business friendly overall from an operating system perspective. I mean, and us here on the panel are allowing for some more of that business functionality to happen, right? But there's this big trend to now, with cloud, try to use and this attempt to use native, the native applications as they were designed to be run on these mobile devices without necessarily, for example, containerizing them, right? There's a big push to try to use as much native and have two sides to a device, have different aspects where you have the personal side and you have the business side and have that clear separation. So ultimately, that's the big challenge, though, is the principal design of these operating systems and how they were designed originally, and now we're backing into it from a business perspective. And I think that's where the challenges start.
Yeah, exactly. And I would put that in one of the buckets of new challenges, because with our desktops and laptops for years, the expectation of even if I have an enterprise-owned device, I have this expectation, if it's an iOS or Android device, that I'm probably doing a bunch of personal stuff on there as well. And it's very personal to me. It has my personal pictures that I may not have done on my enterprise laptop 5 or 8 years ago. But that work and personal coexisting, which I'm sure has been a topic of ET6 and M6, especially when it's been for years and years, is one of our new challenges. And indeed, from what I've seen, there's still a lot of reasons to talk about the work and personal existing on both devices. But the question that I want to ask is that, as I mentioned, by default, we've been trusting these devices very much over the years. Can we?
I think you need to look at what are the threats that you're facing on the devices. I think if you look at SANS, and SANS talks about really the 4 threat vectors of physical, network, there's malware, and then there's just ultimately just vulnerabilities from an operating system perspective that are affecting the devices. We're seeing threats across all those, across our customers today. And there's just not visibility today. So if I asked anyone in the audience today how much malware is in your environment, you're probably not going to know. How many of your employees are connecting to unsecure public Wi-Fi where they could be getting a man-in-the-middle attack? You're probably not going to know because there's nothing telling you and giving you the visibility for it. If I asked you how many threats you've encountered in the last 30 days across all your mobile devices, you're not going to know because you don't have anything that's giving you that level of visibility. And I think really what it is it's the visibility aspect today that people don't have. People have invested in EMM. I was at Mobile Iron. I ran sales at Mobile Iron from the early years through its IPO. And we used to say, we manage and secure your device. But they're not looking for the types of threats that are out there that you've been protecting yourself from in traditional operating systems. It doesn't exist today on mobile.
Well, let's even talk about the patching. So iOS 11.1.1 dropped just a few days ago. I wonder how many out there in the room, and maybe of course with EMM we can tell this, but it would be interesting to ask in your organizations how many of the devices are on iOS 11 already. So that's one thing that we can look at, and as well we can acknowledge in the last couple of years that Google with Android has gotten much better about security patches. There's the stat from the Android security year in review that this is from the 2016 year in review, that 78% of flagship devices, Android devices in the US have a security patch level of the last 3 months or better. So there's good progress in that, and that's something that we can point to.
I think there's good progress in the consumer side or the BYOD side of the house, upgrading to the latest version of the operating system. But I've visited many customers. I spend my time all over the United States, all over the Americas, and the corporate-owned devices is where there's a big gap in security sometimes. I've met with several utility companies that have to use tablets, use iOS tablets, and they're still stuck in iOS 9 due to application compatibility issues and things of that nature. So there are some serious gaps when it comes to on the corporate side as well, simply by the nature of developing your own internal applications, making sure they're supported, that they work in the newer operating systems. Every time you go to a major revision, at least on iOS, there's a lot of dynamic changes that take place, right? So I think there are big gaps and challenges there from maintaining the latest and greatest.
And it's funny, we think of...
Just to add to Ricardo's point, I think the challenge that a lot of organizations are having is the feasibility aspect of not really impacting the end users, right? How do you affect, how do you manage this change management process without really disrupting the workforce? And I think we all know that we face this every single day, having that change management process in place to stay ahead of the curve. But to your point, Samsung's releasing updates every 4 to 6 weeks. They just launched this beautiful new tool called FODA. It's allowing you to sort of streamline that process and sort of over there push this out without minimal or zero end user interaction. So leveraging these tools to really minimize that impact to the day-to-day business practices, I think that's what's going to address that more so than anything, right? And then that allows you to always sort of enhance your security posture as an organization collectively.
Well, let's talk more about that. And I'll mention that Eric McCarty from Samsung was going to be on the panel today, but he had some other business come up this morning. But in fact, I was going to mention the Samsung ePhoto. So for those of you that may not be familiar with this, in mobility, as I mentioned, those flagship devices, Android devices, are starting to have the security patches available. But on the other hand, we have this issue that with most of our iOS device population, as IT, we don't really get to control when our users update those devices. And it's even funny that when we think end users and legacy applications, we think of, applications that maybe ran on XP that we had to update, or our desktop applications. But now that we're 10 years into this mobile era, we have legacy mobile applications. I mean, look at iOS 11. It dropped support for a whole bunch of applications that weren't updated, and you could go into your phone and look at this list and see apps that wouldn't be compatible. And hey, we always thought like it's mobility. We shouldn't have that issue, right?
That's only App Store apps, right? Imagine enterprise-based apps. iOS 11 introduces a lot more. You need to move to a dynamic framework from an application development perspective in order to be, practically very functional in iOS 11. Most enterprise apps are not ready for that, right? And especially if they're being developed in-house. So that's a continuous challenge, right? And there's the whole agility factor of, there's the other side of the coin where you're, publishing app updates on a constant basis, and you want to be able to use that. I think BYOD changes a lot of that adoption, right? And there's a very, very large BYOD initiative across most enterprises today. And that's driving, the updates that we see are being driven by that aspect. There's that clear line now between BYOD devices and you're talking about corporate-owned devices, and the functionalities and things that'll take place and how much access you're gonna have in different, in these different aspects of using these devices. So I think, it hasn't all played out, but there's still a lot of challenges and questions about how we're gonna address those issues.
Well, so let me ask each of you, how are your customers handling, on the one hand, the BYOD devices that we can't determine when they update, and on the other hand, as I mentioned, there's the Samsung ePhoto, which gives really an enterprise level of update control that doesn't really exist in any other mobile devices, versus other scenarios where you may have to hold back devices for application compatibility reasons. How are your customers handling that?
So let me step up on this one. So Mass 360, our product, provides insights into what is your user's current operating system version number. And based on our threat identification and threat management integrations, we're able to scour the web, scour the known vulnerabilities, and kind of provide actionable insights in terms of, okay, 9.3.4 had some known vulnerabilities, and now you have about 30% of your iOS users running that version number. So you, as your IT administrator, can force policies upon those corporate-owned or BYOD devices in terms of if we need to update to a more secure version of the operating system or a secure version of an application that your enterprise has pushed on the device. So I think MDM solutions have a traditional way of looking up what the users have on their devices, and also again, this is where machine learning and the whole unstructured data problems come in, where you can think through and kind of generate those kind of insights and recommendations on what people should be doing to secure their data and devices.
I think when you look at iOS, it's pretty cut and dry. You can look in your system of your EMM and tell what it's on. Basically, what are your device's versionings, and you can tell. In Android, it's a different story. Now, obviously, the enterprise is largely consumed by iOS still, and it's always been that case. But if you look at Android, the ability, some things that we do within our product is, can we look at not only just the carrier and the device, and then we can tell you whether or not that device is available for an upgrade as well. So Android's is a much different game as far as understanding, because that Samsung device on T-Mobile versus AT&T has a different upgrade path that's available for it. And that's something that the enterprise is struggling to understand as far as how do I get my Android devices up to the latest versions. And it's a lot harder to figure out than it is on iOS.
Well, let's talk more about those Android devices, and especially when we're in the wild west of consumer-facing. That having an enterprise deployment of point-of-sale devices, for example, that are managed by Knox, that could have like ePhoto pushed out on them. You could have that very controlled device. But Ricardo, you and I were talking earlier about some of your customers and consumer-facing applications. Are there customers that even they say they draw the line at old Android versions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are customers that draw the line at certain Android versions. But for example, in the healthcare industry, medical tablets have been around for a long time. And
Some of those have to be getting pretty
they're
old
getting
and
pretty
have
old, but they're
very
still
old
being
versions
used
of
and
Android.
replacing them. So we have customers coming to us asking us for support on Android 4.0 practically, or 4.1, and we're like, we'll look at it, but it's tough. It's tough providing that kind of, ultimately what we're focused on is looking at the threats independent of the operating system to give that visibility. Like Jim said, visibility is probably the biggest gap that we see from mobile security is an enterprise being able to go at a C level and be able to state what your risk level is from a mobile perspective. How many attacks are you seeing? How much malware are you seeing? Are you covering all the different vectors that exist out there? And support it in operating systems, 2 or 3 major revisions behind is going to be a key thing that we need to start providing, right? And something that we work on as well, but it's a big challenge.
Well, let's talk about how we get that visibility and how we attest a mobile device, because we were talking about this containerized nature of mobile devices. We have the very closed ecosystems. On an iOS device, for example, if we have an MDM profile on that device, we can look and see what applications are installed. But on the other hand, for a consumer iOS device, for example, Apple's privacy guidelines, we're playing in their world, and Apple's privacy guidelines are one app should not know what the other apps are doing on a device. So, and that's on the Apple side. But on both sides, how do we get more visibility and attestation on these devices?
I think visibility comes with changes in dynamics. I mean, today, most of us are focused on the threat vectors that exist within the constraints of the operating system. But the next, we feel that the next evolution is to be more content aware, right? And the moment we move to content awareness, that also introduces a variety of different questions when it comes to BYOD. Because now, if I have the capability of being content aware, in other words, have the ability to look at what other apps are doing, right? And see that content going out of the device, well, the privacy line is there, right? And how do you establish that?
But again, as a content, are you looking at the other apps on the device? Where are you seeing and from what vantage point?
Well, that's the question. I mean, can we do it development-wise? Technically, it's feasible. The question is, what do you do, right? I met with an organization that's in the logistics industry, and they have a big fear of the unknown, right? And so they have a policy, an HR policy that they have to sign off, where it basically states, even though it's your device, if you leave, I'm going to wipe that device, because they don't have any visibility, right? And so we have a lot of organizations that are implementing these, binary type of decision making, where it's, if I don't know about it or I don't understand it, well, we're just going to control it completely. And in a BYOD environment, it's kind of tough, right? And so you want all this productivity, you want all this access to data, but at the same time, you're going to restrict, or you're going to tell the end user, if it's his device, I'm going to control that device. That kind of doesn't go very well, right? So there are challenges there to overcome.
And it's interesting that in 2017, these are very similar to some of the conversations that we were having back in 2012 and 2011, which that's one soapbox for those of you that read my blog. That's one soapbox I like to stand on. That these are actually still important issues to talk about, and one size does not fit all. But we're talking right now mostly about iOS and Android. But Jim, I'm reminded because Jim, your title is, well, it's not related to mobile, it's related to all modern OS systems. So that leads us into Windows 10.
Yeah. I think if you look at what's going on across literally all these modern operating systems that are coming through, they present different challenges in different use cases, and they all need to be protected. I think if you look at the types of threats that our customers are seeing across those vectors, the Windows and what Microsoft is doing is right in line with the strategy from Symantec's perspective of having to protect.
And so specifically with the modern operating systems, we're talking that Windows 10 can now be managed with mobile device management and things like Credential Guard and Device Guard and the push towards the Windows App Store. really, it's becoming, almost in the last 6 months or so, it's becoming much more explicit that Microsoft's plan is to have Windows 10 much more resemble, in the way that it's locked down, iOS and Android. We even saw Windows 10s come out. So this will be a question both for you, Ricardo, and for you, Jim. With Windows 10 and even Windows 10s, these are looking much more like mobile threat defense issues rather than more traditional endpoint protection issues. So how are you going to be approaching Windows 10?
Carefully. Windows 10, it's evolving. As a matter of fact, I'll even pose a bigger philosophical question when it comes to Apple. Is it going to be iOS or macOS? That ultimately wins out. They're only going to support one operating system.
Both merged together?
You never know, right? But and that's kind of Windows is kind of moving to more of a mobile platform perspective. And the question is, where are the traditional threat vectors today? If you look at Windows XP, Windows 10, Windows 7, right? The most common threat vector there is the most common attack vector is files, right? And looking at, if you look at the sandboxing industry when it comes to sandboxing for files and analyzing for threats that are, malware existing in files, that's kind of where, the focus area is today, right? And so now you're moving into the operating system world, and the file is not as important as a malicious application, right? And a lot of us are focused on, analyzing for malicious apps and having that intelligence there, and basically moving into that world from a Windows perspective is kind of where we're looking at it. And then looking at all the other threat vectors that we see on the mobile side, and we're going to start applying that same concept to Windows 10, right? And how we're going to provide security for that.
So speaking of Windows 10, let's see a show of hands. Who's adopting any of the aspects of, or interested in adopting any of the aspects of Windows 10 modern management, specifically the MDM or the device guard or the credential guard? And who's if not still at least somewhat interested in the Windows 10 modern management features? Well, so we fortunately we have about 28 months left to go on Windows 7. So bringing on to the next topic, we are here to talk about more than just mobility. So cloud, and I'm thinking from an end user application standpoint. Again, cloud security is something that has been talked about ad nauseum. But here in 2017, how should we be evolving our model of thinking about it?
So I'll kind of jump in on this one. Providing access and leveraging, and we talked about this last night as well, leveraging identity-based solutions to limit access to public-based applications. Ensuring that your CRM applications are being accessed from a trusted or managed device. I think that's level one, right? And then looking at what type of data within that application you should be accessing to a specific role and tying that in. So I think from a cloud perspective, it's great. Everyone wants to move to the cloud. Security is a big component to it. And now you just close the loop up from an end user perspective. What's the impact of giving access to that cloud? What happens if there's an application in the cloud that does an automatic update? What's the impact to the end user to be able to access those line of business applications? There's a possibility of that breaking. So going through your change management process to validate, to ensure there's no impact to end users. So cloud is great, I'm all for it, but I think baseline, leveraging solutions like identity, having process procedures in place to go through your change management process, and then taking a step forward from there to address all the needs of that end user.
Yeah, and we hear stories, especially now that the great big Office 365 migration is happening. We hear that that's becoming a big inflection point for single sign-on and IDaaS deployments. The question I had here is, so when it comes to our cloud applications, should we be doing modern identity and access management soon, right now, or yesterday?
Day before yesterday.
Yeah, I think it comes
Yeah,
down to the visibility that you, once again, it's the visibility. So I'm sure many of the folks in the room have deployed CASB or Cloud Access Security Broker tools that just give you the visibility of what type of applications are being used in your environment and what type of security decisions you're making around those applications itself. A lot of people don't know, what type of applications are actually being used. And I think getting controls on the front end of that, as far as how you match up your identity process with that, is very important.
And I think it also ties into end users' requirements, right? Let's we talked about the password reset issue. Show of hands, how many organizations are challenged with password resets today? A few, quite a few. Cert-based authentication, simple as that. Throw a cert on the device, there's no need for a password anymore. Let the EMM solution deliver that cert, renew it, whatever it might be. Cert-based authentication solves that problem. So something as simple as that, which checks your, hits your checklist from a security perspective, and from an end user perspective, it really enhances that experience and drives adoption. Because imagine in healthcare, you have, a few thousand field staff that have to access, this certain proprietary information on this device, are constantly being pinged every 90 days, depending on your security posture, to update a password.
Well,
the cert delivers it.
So we saw this summer the new NIST password guidelines that basically say no more arbitrary complexity requirements, no more 90-day password changes. This is something, when I saw that, I emailed an article about it to my IT administrator. It said, hey, check this out. How many people are looking at relaxing their password rotation and complexity requirements in accordance with those guidelines? Yeah, your users are going to love you.
Or use certs. They're going to love you too.
Yeah, so this is one of those situations where, I think we can all agree that the single sign-on experience, it's a win-win.
Totally.
Yeah, and tying in these modern identity management solutions will provide you a one-stop, rundown on what kind of users have access to what kind of assets and whether or not they should be having it. And those kind of details are necessary given the requirements and structuring of the enterprise. Some of them would entail access on particular devices through their personal devices or through the corporate devices. Some of them might have to do with access to third-party softwares that the enterprise has subscribed to and which the user needs a one-off access or one-time access to. So managing all of that from a dedicated identity and access management software definitely has its upside.
And then once we get our identity and access management system tied into our mobility management system, suddenly we have what seems to me like one of the most important trends of the last year or so in the EMM space is suddenly everywhere we're having conversations about conditional access. So tell me about each of your experiences with getting started with that.
I think the conditional access is, it also introduces the challenge of the BYOD scenario, right? Because traditional conditional access, from an MDM, an EMM perspective, requires a lot more control on the device, a lot more visibility on the device.
But you're saying that a lot of the traditional access assumes we're going to assume a managed device,
right?
And so this sign-in is coming from an MDM enrolled device, and so
organizations want conditional access without necessarily, on a BYOD device, without necessarily having full control of the device. For example, Microsoft Intune provides some of that capability. All the EMMs now have SDKs for supporting man-based scenarios, so applications that are intelligent enough to basically gather information without having a full MDM deployment, right? And so, providing a threat level indicator and a risk level on the device to now make decisions based on that risk level is the direction that we're going in, to basically add value to that whole, decision-making process within an application, right? So there are challenges with BYOD in terms of, once again, to have real conditional access, now you have to kind of be a little bit more content aware. And are you going to go down that road or not?
Yeah, and again, there's that enroll versus not enroll conversation coming up, and it's as active as ever.
So just to add to Ricardo's point, I kind of agree, but I'll pose it in a different way. Microsoft's done some phenomenal things. I think one of the key items is leveraging Word. You install Word and you can actually enroll your device into an MDM application, which is pretty cool, right? Or even Outlook as an app, right? And provide some sort of conditional-based policies to be able to manage that content within that container, if you will. So I think, to your point, they've tried to address the BYOD model to streamline that. But I think this mantra about BYOD, which we have to really state, is what is the business case of BYOD? Are we going to give access to mission-critical applications or allow these individuals on a personally owned device access proprietary, sensitive, which requires a high level of integrity to access this data? Probably not, right? So I think the business case becomes, well, if they're accessing mission-critical applications, we need to be able to update them, et cetera. We talked about iOS updates. You can leverage the DEP program to be able to push out an update, right? So you have that level of control. So maybe the question is, let's move these guys away from BYOD back into corporate.
Exactly. I'm going to play my my millennial card here, and I have plenty of friends that carry around 2 phones, and again going back to these conversations about BYOD that we've been having for a number of years now. At times we might have said, like, sometimes the attitude might be, if someone is carrying around 2 phones, like, maybe why should that be necessary? But on the other hand, as you mentioned, I know that my attitude has changed on that as well. That's perfectly legitimate as well.
Yeah, and I would call BYOD the millennials, right? Like that's because it's constantly changing. Their needs are changing, and you have to think from a support perspective. How are you going to manage this? We talk about visibility to applications. Legally speaking, you can't. You're not allowed to look at the applications of an end user, but there are certain policies on the EMM side that you can limit what you can see as an administrator, but global admin rights still allow me to view that data. So you're going to fight that constant battle. I think at the end of the day, you have to sit down and just realize what is sort of the business impact of you providing this technology to end user, and what is your security posture to manage and ensure that data does not fall in the wrong hands. As simple as that.
Well, so here's another question. Again, this almost sounds like a blast from the past from several years back when we would have had lots of sessions talking whatever are we going to do about these users with their shadow IT and their consumerization. And in part, I think part of the answer is that so many more enterprise apps have become mobile friendly. When a company moves on to an enterprise file sync and share or a whole range of other modern SaaS applications, they become mobile enabled by default. There are so many companies that they may not even have had a meeting about what is our mobility strategy going to be, and I'm talking probably more at the mid-market size, but just because of the progression of, well, now we're on a modern EFSS, hey, we're mobile enabled now. So the question that I have for the panel is rogue IT or shadow IT or consumerization, is that a thing anymore in light of how we've become default mobile enabled?
I still feel if you tell a user no when they want to try to do something, they're going to figure out a way around the process. So you have to give options. I mean, you look at Symantec when Skycure was acquired. They didn't have a BYOD program because they had AirWatch that manages the device, but now with having Skycure and Set Mobile on the device itself, in combination, they're allowing BYOD. So actually, the Skycure group is the first group inside Symantec as a global organization that is now rolling out BYO. So we're like the test bed for it because they feel they have the ability to have some controls in place. If you don't give people access, they're going to find a way around it. And it happens all the time. They will circumvent.
I'll add to Jim's point. I think that's going to happen no matter what. That's a given. I think you need to have the tools in place from a failover perspective. So, for example, if I'm trying to access O365 from an unmanaged or untrusted device, there should be some sort of administration action that takes place that allows us to quarantine that device and access to that email, right? So I think the baseline is obviously you educate, you try to get ahead of the curve, but as a failover, the technology has to be there to prevent any untrusted access, to proprietary information.
Okay, we have about 6.5 minutes left. I have a few shorter point questions. So the first one, and each of you can respond quickly. But 5-7 years ago, we saw, almost people would root and jailbreak for fun as a hobby, because you can say, hey, look, I jailbroke my phone, and now look at these, changes that I can make to the UI of my iPhone. And we've certainly seen a lot of things happen to make that harder. So are users rooting and jailbreaking their phones for fun and for sport? It seems to me that could be less of an issue now. Would you agree, or have any of you seen this?
From personal experience, I can tell you that what I can see in the United States is very different, for example, from Latin America. In Latin America, I sat down with various carriers, and the percentage of jailbroken phones is astronomically high for a lot of different reasons, and that's actually an anti-fraud type of issue that they're trying to work on over there. We don't see that as, in our customer base, we're not seeing as many, jailbroken devices unless it's for testing and things of that nature, unless it's for a malicious intent, And rooting techniques have gotten very advanced these days, where they can hide your tracks when you're basically, there's a lot of defense or evasion techniques where you can still root a device and nobody can know that the right device is rooted, right? So
Even can Checkpoint know?
yes, we do.
So of course, then it's very important to consider the different geographies different. Anything else to add from anybody else?
So I think with the whole advent in enterprise devices and data access, I think there's certainly a lower number, as Rick mentioned, in North America, where you'd see a number of rooted or jailbroken devices in the enterprise. They do exist, but it's not a growing trend from where I could see. I think BYOD, bringing your own device into the enterprise, could have some impact on that, because you certainly, if you enroll your device, it would be managed by the company, and the enterprise wants to make sure that you have the right signatures on the device from the OEM to have you access their critical information.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. So that's interesting to see how those things are changing. In the last few minutes, so we should cover IoT today as well. So as I mentioned, this is a mobile heavy panel, and the level of mobile maturity is very different in many cases than the level of IoT maturity, especially when it comes to security. And I'm reminded of a joke. I wasn't able to contain myself the other day when I thought of this. But they say the S in IoT is for security. So, I'm sorry. So how? Contain yourself. So how bad are things, or how good are things?
I think, to your point, I don't think there's a big separation between the two. And then at the end of the day, that data that we're accessing from those sensors is on a mobile device, right? That data that's sensitive, that has to have sort of an action-based, trigger, whatever it might be, has to populate on a mobile device for us to be able to take that next step. So I think from a security perspective, I think it's still very, very early. I think it's going to mature over time, and we're going to come across a scenario where organizations such as Symantec and Checkpoint are going to look into these, bad vectors, what these individuals are trying to do to penetrate into these sensors, to, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's utilities, et cetera. And then from there, we're going to look at, how do we address this? But I think from the mobile posture, which is accessing data, I think we've talked about it pretty thoroughly. I think that's a core component of it, right? So I'll let them kind of speak to the.
Yeah, from an IoT perspective, today, there are certain limitations that we would have for on-device protection. However, a lot of what we do at Checkpoint is focused on the network side and threat intelligence on the network traffic in and of itself, right? So looking at and detecting based on that, that network flow, if you will, is what our IoT division is focused on more than anything else, and providing a layer of intelligence across that traffic.
Okay, so in our last minute and a half, 2 questions. So very quickly, this one is for Ankur and Deepak. Among your mobility customers, do you see that it's the mobility teams that are expanding into IoT, or are you having operational technology teams come into the EMM space for the first time?
I think operational guys are definitely building the business case, but they're not necessarily well equipped to go out and actually sort of fund that initiative. And that's where the mobility teams are coming in, because a lot of these platforms are well integrated to the IoT side of it, and obviously third-party applications through that platform. I think it's a smooth transition, an easy transition for mobility teams to manage that initiative as well.
I agree. I think there has to be a solid business case or use case to address with the IoT devices and why they need to be connected and what kind of data needs to be collected and transferred to those. And that's the core of it. And once that's in place, if there's even a pilot in place, that's when the mobility team, the geeks jump in and they kind of make it happen. So I think that's how the whole synergy works. And it's very interesting to see some of these use cases come up from all different kinds of verticals.
Okay, so in my last 15 seconds, I'll just ask for a yes or no answer for each of us, from each of you. As we are transitioning from the on-premises and network-based or perimeter-based security models to the cloud and mobile devices can be anything and anywhere. Now that we're getting used to that transition and that new world, are we more future-proof than we used to be? So we'll just go yes or no.
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 Hell no.
No.
Okay, well there we have it. So I'm out of time for today, and I'm seeing Phil come in to give us the indication that we're all done and on to our next sessions. But thanks very much to all of you for answering these questions today, and thanks everybody for listening and having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.